And so I'm going to share with you some of the results, the preliminary results we've been looking at with electronic sow feeding and gestation. And we were very fortunate to send 2 graduate students to a farm in central Nebraska using computerized sow feeding systems and taking a look at what opportunities there might be from a research standpoint to learn more about the patterns of gestation feed intake and growth of sows. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the training process. And as we'll see towards the end of my presentation, this is very, very important. And not only is it a long procedure, this farm happened to have what we would consider an excellent protocol. We'll still see some of the effects that we don't get all the sows or gilts to eat as much as what we'd like. And so Carini documented some of the steps that this farm was using on their group house sows and taking a look at training. And what they were doing, they had a pre-training stage. So once the gilts left isolation and entered gilt development for about 10 weeks in the pre-training stage, then about 2 weeks in the training stage, and then post-training stage when sows and gilts were actually moved to the ESF pens and then back to stalls for insemination. And so the pre-feeding stage is really set up like the auto-sort system of the past, where we have a food court, and we have the sows, the gilts come out of the food court into this area and then congregate up in this area to go through the food court. And so this is what they were doing in that stage from 11 to 21 weeks, going through this food court system. And what was happening, or what they were doing, is that these developing gilts were going through an automatic chute that would get them accustomed to what they'd see later on as they'd go through gestation in the ESF pens. But again, young gilts exposed to this process in order to learn that they need to go through a device in order to eat. One-way gates installed, so again, gilts would enter the food court, leave the food court, but have to go in through the regular scale system in order to eat. Then when they moved from pre-training to training, they entered a separate pen, a different pen, where they had the actual gate of the ESF system in place. However, there were modifications made such that the gates were left partially open so the gilts would learn how to go through the systems much easier. So again, this is the training stage, again, where they'd go through this gate and into a food court kind of system. One of the reasons why we sent 2 students up to central Nebraska is to understand more about gestation feed intake patterns, how gestating feed efficiency, how that takes place, and also to use that information so that we could model the changes in protein deposition, in lipid deposition, and the products of Conceptus, how they all change in relationship to nutrient and feed allowance during gestation. And Lori Thomas, our grad student who's been working on the project, defends her thesis in January, and we'll learn more about some of the definitive results, the modeling effects here early in 2017. So what the protocol is that there were 6 feeding stations, and then after the gilts or sows left the feeding stations, they would walk through this alleyway where a scale was installed. And so Lori looked at about 300 gilts, about 550 sows, and the feed delivery was 4.4 pounds for gilts, 5 pounds for sows, and sows that were deemed skinny got an extra 6.6 pounds or fed a total of 6.6 pounds. And again, what this allowed is every time the sow went through the feeding station that we would go ahead, she would go ahead and cross the scale and a weight would be collected. And one thing that was very important in the modeling process is that Lori went through and individually weighed or stopped a sow as she crossed the scale to get a specific weight. Because as you'll see, there's a lot of variation in weights. And again, just another picture of the scale setup. The sows leave the feeding stations. They walk through this alleyway. The ESF system will kick them out to a holding pen if they're day 112 of gestation or ready to move to farrowing. And again, we get a scale reading, a weight reading over each of the individual sows or gilts. And here's what the data looks like. This is an individual sow, and 2 points that I'd like to make is that there's a fairly consistent change in weight as the sow goes through the system. However, there's a tremendous amount of variation. And the other thing that we learned is sows go through ESF systems 3 to 6 times a day. Even though they may not eat, they go through the system hoping that there'd be feed available. But again, there's a reasonably clear pattern. The other reason why we get some of this variation is whether a sow runs through the scale, whether a sow is halfway on and another sow is halfway on, some of this variation. But again, we get a pretty consistent response over time. The challenge is to weed out some of this variation. And that's where Lori's worked at some of the modeling techniques to extrapolate some of the average daily gain or weight gain and remove some of the outliers in the scale process or in the weighing process, so we can get a better accuracy of changes in weight gain over gestation. And so when we look at the data, we break things down. The blue line is the Parity 1 gilts, Parity 2 in the red line, and green would be Parity 3 and above. Looking at things by stage of gestation, we see that the first 15 days or so of gestation, the sows and gilts really don't gain very much. But it's not until we get to the second 15-day period or day 15 to 30-day period that we see some of the changes in average daily gain. And that gilts gain on average about 150 pounds, including the weight of conceptus, and Parity 2 sows are gaining about 100 pounds. And what's interesting is this spike in weight gain in the Parity 3 sows, and this farm doesn't bump feed. And so, again, some differences in weight gain that we'll see in efficiency just in a little bit. As for average daily feed intake, you'll notice that gestating sows in Parity 2 and Parity 3 and above sows were fed 5 pounds a day. They generally ate all their feed allocation with the exception of the first 15 days. Same thing for gilts that were fed 4.4 pounds. They ate most of their allocated feed throughout gestation, but their feed intake during the first 10 days of gestation is much lower. And actually, when we look at a percentage of feed intake, multi-pair sows and second parity gilts are eating about 95% of their allocated feed the first 10 days of gestation, where gilts, probably because of this training process or difficulty or challenges with the training process, are only eating about 90% of their allocated feed. And so this slide represents some of the variation that we see, and as you recall, we saw decreased feed intake, or about 90% of actual feed intake during the first 10 days of gestation. And this slide represents the variation in feed intake in gilts over that first 5 days to 10 days of gestation, that there are a lot that are eating close to their maximum amount, but there's still a lot of gilts that aren't eating, that are just eating a pound or two of their actual feed allowance. And it's interesting, too, to note the variation as they go through the course of gestation. This line would represent gilts that are eating their full allowance, but again, there's a tremendous amount of variation in feed intake during gestation, especially in gilts. In Parity 2 sows, we don't see the differences or as long a difference in feed intake in early gestation, the first 5 to 10 days, that they have gone through the ESF system once, but still going through it the second time, they need some prompting to relearn the process to go through the ESF system and learn how to eat through the system. And then lastly, the Parity 3 sows, again, do a much better job. They've been accustomed to eating through the ESF system, and again, a lot of sows are eating their allocated amount of feed. There were some skinny sows that were allocated the 6.6 pounds of feed that did a pretty good job of cleaning up their feed allowance. But again, the big thing that we want to focus on is this early stage of gestation and what's going on with feed intake and how that might be influencing subsequent litter performance. And so if we look at feed efficiency, the first 10 days is relatively poor in Parity 2 and Parity 3 sows, because if you remember, they weren't eating very much. And as a result, they're close to their maintenance requirement, so they're eating an allocation just above their maintenance requirement and not growing, so we see relatively poor feed efficiency. But then feed efficiency improves, and we can look at the actual feed efficiency of gestating sows over time, with gilts having the best feed efficiency, obviously because they're still growing and depositing lean tissue, whereas older Parity sows are growing as well, but not as putting on as much lean tissue deposition as the gilts. So the take-home message, the things that Lori's been doing a great job looking at is, first of all, the ESF systems allow for great opportunities for modeling protein and lipid deposition that we can then tie back into a nutrition program on allocations of amount of feed, different nutrient levels, but allows us some great research opportunities. But what the preliminary data suggests is that gilts and even Parity 2 and sometimes Parity 3 sows have challenges going through the ESF system. And so that takes a little bit of extra management when those animals are first moved into the system in order to reteach them or teach them to eat. And the question that we're hoping to answer is, will these changes in initial feed intake affect subsequent reproductive performance? So that's a little bit on what's been going on. Again, Lori and Carini have done a super job with their research, and we're looking forward to Lori defending her thesis in January.